Hello class. Welcome to Advanced Placement United States History. In this lecture, this is 1.1, we're going to be discussing Unit 1 of the AP curriculum, which covers 1491 to 1607. That's the meat and potatoes of Unit 1. Your textbook corresponds with this with chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook. So Unit 1 of the AP curriculum corresponds with chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook. Now, our lectures are going to be titled 1.1 through 1.7. So we're going to break up Unit 1 into 7 individual lectures. For this particular lecture, 1.1, I'm just here introducing myself, introducing Mr. Giardina, by the way. For those of you who don't know, I apologize for that. We're going to be talking about the basics of what we're going to do in this course, the overview of the course as a whole, and 1.1 of the AP curriculum. We're going to talk about in this lecture we're going to talk about an overview of everything we're going to cover generally for Unit 1, which is going to be, again, this particular lecture, 1.1, is just an overview of everything we're going to be covering for your first test, which is chapters 1 and 2, Unit 1 of the AP curriculum. Okay, let's get started. A couple things. When we say history and we say the past, you're probably thinking, well, what's the difference? Well, there is a distinct difference in terms of academia as a social science. The past, everything that happened prior to our living now, everything that happened yesterday and before, all the people, the places, the events, the facts. So, how does that differ from history? What is history? History is the analysis and the study of and the interpretation of, more importantly, those facts, those people, those places, those events. Um, when you are reading a history book that was written by a historian or a team of historians, all of those facts and events are presented through a specific lens. In other words, a viewpoint, depending on who wrote them. If you're talking about the history of America, you can look at it from different viewpoints. If you pick up an American history book written by British historians, you're going to get a different viewpoint than if you pick up one written by American historians or Native American historians for that matter. Same facts, same events, same people, same places, different interpretations. And that's going to come into play later when you're writing essays and during historical arguments and thinking and all that kind of stuff, which we're going to get into detail later, so don't worry about that now. Um, so the past, the events that occurred, and the history, the interpretation of those events. Um, so that being said, where does American history actually begin? Some of you, if I asked you if this is a live class, you might say, where does American history begin? Some of you would say Columbus. Some of you might argue a little more nuanced opinion. Well, it actually begins in North America before Columbus arrived, or in England before Columbus sailed over, or it actually begins with the Pilgrims, or with the first colonies, and so forth. And those would all be valid points and valid arguments, actually. You could also argue that American history begins in 1776, when America began as a nation state, when they first formulated that idea to break off and become their own country. You could make that the starting point of American history and have a valid reason for doing so. Um, More commonly, most textbooks, they start with 1492, or in the case of AP, US history, they start with 1491. Does that mean they start in that exact year? Well, they use that as a starting point because that's the marker for pre-contact, pre-discovery, pre-connection between the North American continent and civilizations of the North American continent and Europe, and those two civilizations discovering one another. So 1491 is that year prior to that event and everything that happened leading up to that point in North America and in England. That's what AP generally looks at as the focus. Some have argued that 1607, the first British settlement, Jamestown, permanent British settlement, not the first settlement, but the first permanent settlement, Jamestown, 1607, is an arguing starting point. Some say 1619. More recently, some historians have argued this, that the arrival of the first African slaves to the first English settlement, that mixture of those of African descent, European descent, Native American descent, converging, that convergence point is the beginning of what will become American history. And you can make a valid point for that argument as well. Or 1620, the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth in order to find a home where they can practice their religious freedom. If you wanted to present American history as the story of religious freedom, you would start there. So different lenses, all the same facts, all the same people, places, and events, very different stories, and that's history. Okay, the outline of this course. There are AP advanced placement time periods, periods 1 through 9, which this again is 1491 through 1607. And as we go through these time periods, they've broken them up based on major events and major cultural shifts that encapsulate these different time periods. And as we go through this, those are excellent markers to kind of frame your mind around where we are. But as time goes on in this course, we're going to be talking a lot about the flow of history. And we're going to move away gradually from those periods as markers and more of knowing what the events and how they connect across periods and times and American history as a story as a whole. And that'll become more relevant and more important. And we're going to get into it a lot more later as the course goes on. Um, a major way to approach this class in terms of note taking, studying, what should I pay attention to? Should I write down every date that I hear? First of all, no. Major dates, yes, and they will be highlighted and pointed out. And you're going to have to know certain date markers, like 1492, contact, pre and post, different worlds. That's a big one. Modern history, September 11th, 2001, pre-September 11th, post-September 11th. Very different worlds, geopolitically, politically, culturally. A lot changed. Uh, Dates of those extreme nature, yes, you will know. And we're going to fill in many along the way as well. You do not have to know every single date. Dates do help. Major dates help tremendously. And we're going to be looking at this course through those major dates to get an outline so you can put smaller events in between those major events to kind of know where you are and what happened and the flow of history and how things changed and why over these major events. Okay, once we get familiar with the broad outline of things, and we're going to do this on a period by period basis and expand our timeline as the course goes on, we're going to go back and fill in with stories. So this lecture, for instance, 1.1, we're going to be talking about the broad view of the next 1.2 through 1.6. 1.7 will be a summation. 1.2 to 1.6, we're going to be talking about specific events and more narrowing events between 1491 and 1607 generally. But for purposes of this, and we're going to do all of it this way, we're going to start off with the broad scope, the beginning and the end, and then we're going to go back and fill in the details. Okay. Quick note about reading history and writing history and thinking and arguing historically, thinking like a historian, and how that differs from, say, a literature class. When you are reading history, you are not waiting for this big ending that you don't want to get spoiled to, so you don't read the ending first. No, you look at the whole picture. How did it begin? How did it end? Then you go back and analyze how you got there. You fill in the gaps. So reading history is a lot different than reading literature. Writing history is no different. It's going to be very different than writing an essay, say, for a book. Yes, there are characters, there are events and things you have to know, but writing history is very different in the sense that lens that we talked about, depending on your perspective and who you are and where you're from, that's going to influence your writing. Your personal perspective as a junior in high school, analyzing these events from your personal lens. So, right and wrong is going to differ a lot in terms of what you might think. It's going to be more of your opinion within the facts that are presented and interpretations of these events. And how does that work? And how do you analyze that? How do you argue that? So that's what we mean when we say writing historically. And that also goes into play of thinking historically, thinking like a historian. And that's a lot of what we're going to be training you to do over these next, the extent of this course, 9 months or so, um, plus the summer. um, how to think like a historian, how to write like a historian, how to argue and debate, and how to come to your own opinion as a historian. Okay, so moving on from our intro, first thing we're going to be talking about, Unit 1, Period 1, 1491 to 1607, Lecture 1.1, Contextualizing Period 1. We're going to be putting that date time frame into context, meaning what happened right before this time period, what happened during it generally, what happened after. What's the broad outline? How do we place this into a broader context? What were the themes? What was happening in society? What were people thinking? What were they like? How do they differ from different time periods, especially from us or even time periods closer to them? Okay. Our lesson objective: explain the context for European encounters in the Americas from 1491 to 1607. In other words, what was the context under which these encounters, this East meets West, this European civilization meeting this North American civilization? Okay. Unit 1 context. As native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct increasingly complex societies by adapting and transforming their environments. So one of the things we're going to be looking at in this series of lectures, 1.2 through 1.6, we're going to be talking about how and why the different, and they're very diverse, the different native populations in North America, Central America, up through Canada, why they moved around. What was their cause for moving around? Was it food sources? Was it environment? Was it war? Was it disease? What were the reasons? We're going to talk about the variation of those societies, the complexity of those societies, and how they changed, and how they changed their environment, and how the changing environment in turn changed their way of life. These are things we're going to be looking at starting with 1.2. Um, Moving on from there, we're going to look at different native societies, how they adapted, transformed their environments through innovations in agriculture, resource use, and social structure. So, very quickly, social structure and resource use is going to be a heavy component in looking at the themes and that flow of history that we talked about, and how those social structures change and how that affects other things and other decisions that people make, and putting their decisions in context. Okay. We're also going to look at further along in these lectures in Unit 1, contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans, and how that resulted in what's called the Columbian Exchange and significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. It cannot be underestimated the effects of the Columbian Exchange. In other words, crops, animals, diseases, uh, cultural influences that did not exist on either continent when that contact was made and things were shipped back and forth between those two continents, how that changed the environments, the culture, the food, the lifestyle. It sent both the continents on a trajectory that would never be the same from 1491, 1492 on. We got a different world. And we're going to dive into all that deeply in these lectures in Unit 1. European expansion into the Western Hemisphere generated intense social, religious, political, economic competition and changes within European societies. So, this Columbian exchange, we're going to talk separately, deeply about the effects in Europe. If you remember your AP Euro class, we're going to talk about how the Columbian exchange sent Europe on a different trajectory, but not only in terms of agriculture and available food, but in terms of economics, religion, cultural movements, and a whole host of things. Another thing we're going to look at, oops, sorry, the Columbian Exchange and the development of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere resulted in extensive demographic, economic, and social change. So separately, we're going to take a closer look at the Spanish Empire in North America, where they went geographically, how it differed from the French and the English, what impact they had, the areas that they were in, and when they left those areas, when the English came in, and how that affected the Native American tribes that were in those areas, and all of that. We're going to dive into that in Unit 1 in greater detail. Moving on from there, we're going to look at in their interactions, Europeans and Native Americans asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. So we're going to look at very closely and have some debates in class about this, about how the different gender roles and societal roles and what was required of men versus women and children in Native American societies versus those same roles in European societies, how they differed, and how when they started to intermingle, how they started to trade, sometimes conflict with each other, and sometimes going back and forth over religious values and ideas, and how different those societies were, and how that affected each of them separately, and what path that would send them on and why. Okay, so that's a brief overview of Unit 1, what we're going to be covering. Also, just a brief introduction to the approach to history that we're going to be taking. And most of these videos are going to be between, I'm going to say, I don't want to totally guess, but probably between 15 and 20, 25 minutes. I'm going to leave it at that in length. And now, if you have any questions whatsoever, and I said this in the about this course attachment in the original email, if you have any questions at all, any confusion about how should I take notes? Am I taking too many notes? Am I missing something? How should I be approaching thinking about this class? Or how much time should I be spending on reading this or that? Or what should I memorize and not memorize? Any of those questions, please feel comfortable, feel free to email me. I am truly one of those teachers when I say that there is no dumb question, there isn't. And if it is, I'll never tell you. No, just kidding. There are no dumb questions. The only question I consider a dumb question is the one that is never asked. And my approach to this is that there can only be dumb answers. But no, I'm going to do my best to answer every possible question you have and to bring you to an understanding of the material, get you comfortable with the material, because this is a challenging course. It is a lot of material to cover, but I have all the confidence in the world that you all are going to do fantastic. And if you have any doubts about anything, which I hope you don't, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to get back to you as quickly as possible and get you on the path to success. See you next time.